Welcome to Beat Diabetes. We're going to continue to look at Dr. Sarah Hallberg's book. Quite a powerful book, considering it was written in the last year or so of her life. She wrote this knowing she was dying of lung cancer. And it's called Status Quo Thinking is Harming Your Health. Perfect title for the book. Perfect title, really, for her life. She fought the status quo when it came to nutrition and the idea of how do you beat diabetes, how do you beat obesity. So last week when I shared from this book, I talked about how she just had a little bit of the rebel in her. She couldn't always accept the way things were, the status quo. And one of the things that bothered her was the idea that doctors are just prescribers. Obviously, every doctor knows they're more than that, but in many cases, that's about all it works out to. You come, you tell them the problem, they tell you what medication they're going to prescribe for you. You go get the medication and hope it works. And she just wasn't satisfied. It's not that medication can't help in many cases, but there's got to be more to it than that, especially when it comes to diabetes and obesity. And they go together so perfectly that you treat one, you've treated the other, basically. So she went about 7 years as a primary care physician and wasn't very happy. She was getting burned out. This was not what she essentially signed up for to be a doctor. Just people come in like on some kind of an assembly line, and one after another. Every 10 minutes you see another patient, or 15 at the most. So everything began to change when they asked her at Indiana University. She was working for the Indiana University Health Department to consider becoming the head of their new obesity department. And she jumped at that. She thought, well, this will be different. And what's more, she got excited because they offered her a year to research obesity. And there are certain tests you have to take, board certifications you have to get to be an obesity specialist. And so she had a year where she didn't see nearly so many patients, and she got to travel to go to conferences. She had time to read books and read research papers, and it just freed her up to consider things she just didn't have time to consider in the past. So she was thrilled. And one of the things she says that I can very much identify with was her attitude going into her research about obesity. She says everything was on the table. The science, the facts, evidence-based results, all this would rule the day, whatever they showed. In other words, she didn't go in with a bias. It's not like, well, I know already what it's going to be and I'm going to take a few courses, but I already know how you treat obesity. No, she went and she said, it's all on the table. Whatever I find out, whatever I figure out during this year of reduced patients and more classes, more conferences, more research, let's see what's really going on in this area of obesity. And of course, if you're involved with obesity, you're involved with diabetes, because obese people just have a much higher chance of being diabetic, and diabetic people are much more likely to be obese. So indirectly, though she didn't exactly think of it that way, when she studied obesity, she was studying diabetes. And yes, I know that there are slim diabetics, so you don't have to write to me and correct me and say, well, don't you know? Yeah, I do know, but the majority are obese. Anyway, everything in her life changed when she went to a conference, and she didn't really know what she was getting into. It was put on by Jeff Volek, Dr. Jeff Volek, and Dr. Steve Phinney, who were low-carb guys. And they were going pretty much against everything she'd been taught and heard as to how you combat obesity. She'd been taught the answer is a low-fat diet, and by the way, don't eat many calories and focus on low-cal, small portions, low-fat. And they came along saying something entirely different. They were into the low-carb approach for both obesity and diabetes. And she says, after hearing their first talk, I thought, you know, that kind of makes sense. Again, you see the free thinker that Sarah Hallberg was in those days and was throughout her life. That kind of makes sense. She didn't dismiss it out of hand like many would, say, well, that's not what I grew up hearing. That's not what I learned in med school. It's like, well, that kind of makes sense. Now listen to this. She says, after hearing their second talk, I thought, that makes so much sense. First talk kind of makes sense. Second talk makes so much sense. And she began the process by which she would transform from low-fat, low-cal approach to a low-carb approach. Forget about the calories altogether. Just keep the carbs low. She asked them, well, is there, not them, but she asked one of the conference attendees, is there a book that I can get? They said, well, they wrote the book. And they had written a book called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living by Pollock and Finney. She got hold of it, and that night she read the entire book. And she was overwhelmed. If their talks had made a lot of sense, the book made even more sense. She says, I could call the lectures or the book my aha moment, but those few days at the conference were really my aha weekend at the start of an aha year. It was more than a shock to my system. Yes, what I heard and read made sense, but first I had to jettison what I had long believed. And what I believed was what so much of the medical establishment and general public had long believed, that low fat and low calorie were the way to go. The thing that enabled her to make the pivot, which is absolutely crucial. If you're going to beat diabetes, you're going to have to pivot from what you've been hearing. But that statement we read earlier, everything was on the table. Now, I have to say, this reminds me of myself. No, I'm not a doctor, and I didn't go to a bunch of fancy conferences, and I didn't even read a lot of books. I read a few. But everything was on the table when I started having blood sugar problems. I had such terrible blood sugar problems. If someone told me that standing on my head 2 hours a day would fix it all, I would have done that. If someone told me that dyeing my hair orange would fix everything, I would have done that if I believed it. I was ready to believe anything, and that's why when I read an article about giving up all kinds of animal products and just leaning into the plant products and becoming a vegetarian, that would fix it, that's exactly what I did. And it didn't last too long. It lasted about maybe 2 months. And things got worse for me. My blood sugar was more erratic than it ever had been before. And I may not be the smartest, brightest bulb in the pack, but I've got enough sense to know that if something's not working, you look for something else. Let me say that again. If something's not working, you look for something else. And one of the craziest things going on in the world of nutrition over the last 50 years is we've been clinging desperately to the low-fat, don't worry so much about the sugar, the whole grain approach. We've just clung to it like it was our precious baby, even though it didn't work then, it doesn't work now, and 100 years from now, it still won't work. It just doesn't work. But in my mind, I didn't care. I wasn't so committed to one way or the other. I was like, just show me something that works. And when I went vegetarian and upped my carbs a bit and quit eating animal products, boom, it was terrible. It was much worse. And I'm like, well, this doesn't work. That was her attitude as well. Everything's on the table. I just want something that works. And she quickly discovered that the low carb approach works much better. So she said, I had to jettison what I had been taught, what I had believed, that you focus on low calorie and you focus on low fat and you cut the meat and you increase the plant products, which most plant products contain a lot of carbs. Not all. There are low carb veggies and there are even some low carb fruits like berries. But most plant products are high in carb. So she's like, well, this may well work. And the more she researched it, the more she became convinced it would work. She goes on to say That's how I came to understand that a low-fat diet with its high carbohydrate corollary, and boy, that's powerful all by itself. If you go low-fat, you're going to almost surely go high-carb, unless you're just going to eat almost all protein. So the minute you say, I'm going to go low-fat, cut the fat, hardly any fat at all, boom, up go the carbs. It almost has to be. So she says, I came to understand that a low-fat diet with its high carbohydrate corollary makes zero physiological sense for anyone with insulin resistance. That includes, I now knew, most people with obesity, everyone with type 2 diabetes, and many people without diabetes as well. 0 sense, as in none. And Sarah Hallberg, Dr. Sarah Hallberg, studying to be obesity specialist Sarah Hallberg, who would later morph into diabetes-busting Sarah Hallberg, had her aha moment, and she jettisoned her idea that you fix obesity or you fix diabetes by just cutting your calories way down, and you eat very, very low fat. She became a convert. Well, I did too. Now, my conversion wasn't because of a fancy conference that I went to. And it really wasn't because of a book I read, although there were a few books that pointed me the right direction. But ultimately, my conversion came from little Mike the glucose meter. My aha moment happened over one weekend, folks, one weekend. Turned everything around for me. I was on a ministry trip. I don't even remember what state I was in, what city I was in. I just knew I was on a ministry trip. And typically I didn't do much in the day. I preached in the evenings. So in the daytime, I'd go out to a restaurant, sometimes by myself, sometimes with the pastor. But I had just learned to start testing my glucose. And my blood sugar was bouncing all over the place, going way too high after first eating and then dropping too low after a while. And I was starting to test. And I found that I generally hit my peak as to how high it would go about an hour after I finished my meal. So I would do that. I would finish my meal, check my watch or set a timer, and see where it went. So I decided to do a meal and test it while I was on this trip. And I had a hamburger. Well, the meat was fine, but the problem was it was a big hamburger with giant hamburger bun on top and bottom. Just probably 45, 50 grams of carbs just with the bun itself, and then a big bunch of corn chips as well. And it jumped up. I think it was in the 180s, close to 190. I was depressed. I thought, boy, that's not good at all. I knew that wasn't good. I mean, granted, it's not 300 and 400 like for some of you. I was just moving into the land of diabetes. I wasn't as fully established as some, but for me, 185, 190, too much. Depressing. The next day, I said, let's do another test. So this time I ordered a chef's salad, or a garden salad, you might call it. And it had the ham and the cheese and lettuce, of course. And it had croutons, but I knew enough to decide, let's just get rid of the croutons. So I took my spoon and got rid of all the croutons. Ate the salad with, I think it was some ranch dressing, and tested an hour after I finished the salad. And it was like 118 or 120. And that's where I had my aha moment. Not at a conference. Thank God for good conferences, but I wasn't in the business of going to food conferences in those days. But because of Mike the Meter saying the first meal was unacceptable, the second meal was perfectly acceptable. And I was off and running, and I started testing my food like crazy. My friend, you need an aha moment, and your aha moment, it may help to listen to this guy, but really you need a glucose meter to confirm what this guy is saying to you. I had the glucose meter. I couldn't argue with him. I couldn't say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You ought to be a vegan. I couldn't argue with my meter. He's not a real person. Don't tell Mike that. He's just a little mini computer that can do one thing only. He can tell you what your current blood sugar is. And I could not argue with him. When he said you're at 200, okay, I'm at 200. When he said you're at 118, well, that sounds pretty good. You need an aha moment. And once you do, you'll be like Sarah Hallberg, you'll be like me, you will be off to the races. Now, there's a lot of other good reasons to do low carb, besides just what your glucose meter tells you. But if you've got bad diabetes, you want one thing, you want to get those numbers down. Not so much by high-powered meds and jamming yourself full of insulin, but by a dietary approach that will not provoke high glucose. Check it out. Check out what Mike the Meteorite will have to say to you, and have your own aha moment. I want to remind you that we've grouped certain videos together into series that are available for you to download on your phones or computers. Out of the many hundreds of videos I've made about diabetes, I've put together 3 series that I consider to be the most important and fundamental for the newly diagnosed diabetic who is desperate to get their blood sugar down in a hurry. First is the original series I call the Diabetes Emergency Kit. Second is the series titled More Fundamentals of Beating Diabetes. And third is my latest series called Beat Diabetes in 6 Months, and these are videos specifically created from our Beat Diabetes challenges. There'll be a link in the description that will take you to where you need to go to purchase any one or all 3 of these Beat Diabetes series. You can watch the videos immediately on your phone or computer, and you can also download them. Also, I give you permission to copy these files, put them on a flash drive, and share them with someone you care about.